Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I am starting a new series I'm calling Archaeology 101 where I walk you through the basics and eventually the complexities of archaeology. Since this is the first episode, it makes sense to start with talking about what archaeology is. Basically, archaeology is the study of the human past through the things those people left behind. These things can be any sort of object, including written documents, human remains, the remains of other living or previously living things, or structures and features like buildings and roads. Put simply, if humans had something to do with it at any point in the past, archaeologists will study it. So what's the difference between archaeology and history? This is a very common question. Really, they're both similar fields with similar goals. Both study the human past and generally want to understand how people lived and saw each other in the past in order to inform parts of the present. Archaeologists often study historical documents, and historians often look at archaeological evidence to make their conclusions. The primary difference between historians and archaeologists is what we each emphasize in our study of the past. While historians often do look at material culture, their primary focus is on historical documents and what they can tell us about the past. Similarly, while archaeologists often consult historical documents, we focus primarily on material culture and what that can tell us about the past. Both fields are trying to answer questions about what happened in the past, and in most cases, we work together to find those answers. The biggest difference is in the material that we turn to first when trying to answer those questions. So, if we're talking about the past, how long ago is the past? One of the most common questions I get as an archaeologist is, how old does something have to be to count as archaeology? There are lots of answers to this, actually. The standard answer in archaeology, believe it or not, is 50 years. If something is 50 years old or older, then it counts as archaeology. That's a great standard way of thinking about things, but there are a lot of exceptions to the rule. For example, 50 years ago was 1971. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and no archaeologist would argue that pieces of that wall or anything associated with its demolition is somehow not archaeological. It very much is. In fact, most things that have happened in the last 50 years can be archaeological, even seemingly mundane things like what you ate for breakfast this morning. There's arguably a point to be made that something as recent as what you ate for breakfast this morning isn't archaeological yet, but where the line is between what is currently archaeological and what is soon to be archaeological is generally up for debate. There have been a lot of archaeological studies, for example, that look at modern people's garbage in landfills, and I've also met archaeologists who excavated the Atari dump site in 2014. Really, the past is the past, no matter how long ago it occurred. But there are other exceptions too. Imagine somebody saying that we should excavate the local cemetery. There would be a lot of conflicting opinions, and there wouldn't be a clear answer. Even if you want to limit the graves you disturb to ones that were buried prior to 1971, there would still be a public outcry from people who were alive prior to 1971 and from the descendants of those who were buried before 1971. Basically, even though the past is the past no matter how long ago it occurred, the more sensitive a site or excavation or object is, the longer we are going to wait to excavate it. That's not always the case, but it often is. So the next question you might be wondering is, do archaeologists dig up everything? Well, yes and no. Archaeologists will dig up anything that is archaeologically relevant or that may be archaeologically relevant once they've decided to dig it and have permission to do so. Caves, bogs, ancient latrines, graves, gravel pits, old trash heaps, old compost dumps, general sludge, archaeologists will generally dig up anything. Or certainly will dig in anything. But archaeologists don't just dig up anything. We tend to make very careful choices about which sites we dig and how much of a site we dig in any given season. And we do that for a few reasons. First, archaeology is destructive. Once you dig up a site, you can't put it back the way it was. You can only dig it once. The best you can do is to document what it was like as best you can for anyone else who wants to understand what your excavation did. The best way to preserve an archaeological site most of the time is to actually leave it in the ground. If we don't have the means to preserve the site or the finds from it, say in a museum or other heritage setting, then we might choose to leave the site untouched if it's not being threatened by things like looting or erosion or construction. The site of Pompeii is actually an excellent example of this. Excavations began as early as the mid-1700s, but the exposed areas were often left to decay, and the site began to deteriorate. A major earthquake struck the site in 1980, which caused significant damage to the site, and since then, the only excavations allowed are either in the areas that have already been excavated, or they have been specific, targeted studies that require looking at areas outside of those that have already been excavated. But as I mentioned earlier, this will change if a site is under threat by something like erosion or looting or construction. So if you look at this site in this Minecraft world that I've created, for example, this is on the edge of a body of water. And these objects, even though they've been waterlogged for a while, they've been under the sand as well. They've been waterlogged in sand. And now that sand is gone. If the water keeps moving around the remains of this boat, those remains will deteriorate. And so it might be better to excavate this site and move those into a local museum, even if the local museum isn't necessarily the best place for them, because at the very least, it's probably better than these objects staying where they are and continuing to be subject to coastal erosion. Basically, if it's safer for the finds to stay in the ground, and we don't have some kind of pressing research question that needs to be answered, we will often leave them in the ground. But in this case, if it's not safer for them to stay in the ground, then we'll excavate. The second reason archaeologists don't just dig up anything, or really the reason we haven't dug up everything, is that there are millions, if not billions, of archaeological sites all over the world, many of which we don't even know about yet. Remember, anything that's over 50 years old tends to be considered archaeologically relevant, and obviously time keeps moving forward, so the 50-year mark also keeps moving forward. That means that more and more sites become archaeologically relevant every single day. Unless you live somewhere where everything in your town was built after 1971 and nobody ever lived in that area before you, chances are that every single house in your neighborhood, every apartment block on your street, every bodega, every parking garage, every road, every stop sign, everything are all archaeologically important in some way. It isn't physically possible for archaeologists to dig everything that is archaeologically important. We certainly give it a good try, but there are only so many of us, and excavating a site systematically and documenting what you find so that others can know about it too takes a lot of time. Many sites are excavated over several years, and many of the bigger sites have had ongoing excavations for over a century. Remember how I said in Pompeii that excavations began as early as the mid-1700s? They haven't necessarily stopped. They've been pretty much ongoing since then. And the Temple of Zeus I built last week in Minecraft, that sits on a site with 70 other temples, and that's just the temples. The whole area has been almost continuously excavated since 1875, and we are still not done. That is one site. We don't have enough archaeologists or enough funding to excavate everything. And if we can't excavate a site well enough due to lack of people or lack of equipment or lack of funds or lack of ability to take care of the materials we're taking out of the ground, then generally speaking, unless that site is under a bigger threat, like I mentioned earlier, we're gonna leave it in the ground because it's not worth doing the job poorly. Another reason we might not excavate a site, or might not excavate part of a site, is because we know that future developments in archaeology will be able to answer many of our questions better than we might be able to right now. A good example of this is radiocarbon dating, which everybody pretty much associates with archaeology. But did you know that while radiocarbon dating was first developed between 1939 and 1949, it wasn't widely known in archaeology until the 1950s and 60s, and until the 60s and 70s, many archaeological excavations couldn't actually afford to test radiocarbon samples. We always try to collect everything that might be archaeologically relevant at a site, but imagine if you were excavating in the 1920s or 30s. Radiocarbon dating wasn't even developed. It wasn't even beginning to be developed then. You might know that charcoal samples may become highly important in 30 to 40 years, or you might just decide to collect all of them, but it might be really difficult to figure that out preemptively. Many archaeologists will leave portions of a site unexcavated specifically because there may be advances in the next decades or centuries that would give us more information, but might require samples or data that we don't currently collect. And one of the big ways we do this is we might only excavate half of a site, or half of a feature, and I'll talk about that in a future episode. But you can see in this site in Minecraft that I've built, there's actually more to this site. You can see the wall disappearing into the soil there, and you might be wondering, Archaeoplays, why not just excavate the rest of the site? But the fact of the matter is that somebody else coming along later might have better technology than I do, and if I excavate the whole thing, there's nothing left for them. This way, I've left half of the site, I've got half of the information, which is generally a significant portion of information. You can see how much I've already collected. But what that means is that whoever is coming along next has something that they can excavate, has something they can investigate with the new techniques that get developed. And a final, really big reason, huge reason, that we might not excavate a site is because we don't have permission to do so. Many sites are sacred or important to many different people, and those individuals might not want us to dig up their holy or sacred sites. It may also be that while certain groups are happy for archaeological research to happen at a sacred or protected site, they may not want foreign archaeologists or archaeologists from an outside group to do the excavation for fear of outsiders unknowingly disrespecting the site. To excavate a site legally, you generally need the permission of the landowners, the permission of the local government, and in many cases, the permission of the descendants of the people you are excavating. You can't just excavate a site on your own because you want to. That's actually often illegal in most places. So don't go out and excavate a site just because you feel like it. Now, as I'm talking about sacred places or groups not wanting outsiders necessarily meddling in a sacred place, you may be thinking about, say, First Nations groups or indigenous communities around the world for this, and you absolutely should, because a lot of archaeology, certainly in the past, has very unfortunately often ignored the wishes of local communities. These days, many archaeologists definitely pay attention to it, but I have still seen archaeologists not care so much about the local communities that they're working in. But as much as you might be thinking about First Nations or indigenous communities or local communities, this also applies everywhere in the world. It applies in your backyard. It applies in your neighborhood, in your country, in your town, wherever you are and wherever you might be interested in archaeology, this applies. For example, excavating here in Scotland on the grounds of a church that is still in use requires permission from both the church and, if there are graves inside those grounds, as there often are in Scotland, any archaeological work will require the permission of any of the descendants or loved ones of any of the graves that might be affected. And that's not just if you're digging up a grave or digging past a grave, if you're digging around a grave, if you are digging near a grave, or if you're trying to bring heavy equipment near a grave site, you need to have permission of the people who will be affected. In the end, while knowledge of the past is a noble pursuit, it is absolutely not worth disrespecting the local customs and preferences, no matter who the local community may be. Also, while we're on this topic, just to bring up a related point, you might often hear someone argue that everything should be studied archaeologically or everything should be excavated because the past belongs to everyone. And you often hear this in connection with the idea that studying the past, gaining knowledge of the past, is a noble pursuit, and you also often hear it brought up in relation to negotiations with local communities' preferences over what actually happens, either at a site or with whatever is recovered from the site. While it's somewhat true that the past belongs to everybody, we're all humans, and the past of humanity is a connected past, there are almost always certain groups of people that have a far more direct connection to different archaeological sites, objects, or subjects than others. For example, Uluru is more directly connected to the Aboriginal Australian tribes that still use the site than it ever will be to the tourists who are visiting. And if we go back to the local cemetery example, the descendants of the individuals buried in the cemetery and the local parishioners who attend that church are generally going to be more directly connected to that site than anyone else who is still living. To frame this point another way, there are certain groups that would be harmed more than others if we don't respect their wishes. In all honesty, unfortunately, many of the times I've heard the argument that, quote, the past belongs to everyone, it's used by people or institutions more as a reason to ignore the desires of the people who are most directly connected to whatever is being discussed, rather than as some ethical ideal or ethical argument that that person or institution actually holds. That isn't always the case, but it is mostly the case. And a good question to ask yourself when you hear somebody say this is whether they would say the same thing about something specific to their own culture. For example, the British Museum argues that the Elgin marbles should stay in London because the past belongs to everybody. But would they be saying the same thing if the Romans had carted Stonehenge off to Italy and refused to give it back for the same reason? Personally, I'm not so sure. And there you have it. That's a short overview of what archaeology is and what archaeologists do. There's a lot more to get into with this series, like how archaeologists find sites to dig, what systematic excavation is, and how we communicate what we've found to each other and to non-archaeologists, so stay tuned if you're interested in the answers to those questions. Also, if you do have questions, please let me know in the comments down below and I will do my best to answer them in future videos. Also, let me know what your favorite archaeological site is in the comments and why you like it so much, because it's always fun for everyone to learn about new archaeological sites they might never have heard of. If you liked the video, please feel free to hit the thumbs up and subscribe for future updates. Also, I recently launched a Patreon. Patrons get access to the schematics for the sites that I build in Minecraft, like that Temple of Zeus I built last week, along with things like Patreon-only live streams and monthly Q&As. If that sounds like something you might be interested in, or if you'd just like to support what I do, check out the link in the description down below. That's all from me for today. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye!